Jess, can you hear me okay?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you wonderful. And hey, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this. I know I've been aware of your stuff for a couple of years now, and as obviously we are a very meat happy community here, and we're excited to do that. So usually, we chat for a while, and then we'll let people have the option to ask you. They'll put questions in the chat, and I'll try to relay those to you as appropriate. But welcome to our MeatRx platform. We got some very dedicated meat eaters here, and so I know you are also one of those. And
Definitely.
if you don't mind, can you just kind of give us a little, because there's some folks that may not be aware of your background. I know you kind of talk about being a hardcore carnivore and have a lot of cooking and recipe stuff around that sort of theme. So can you give us a little bit of background? You're in last I heard, I thought you were in Texas. Is that
Yes.
still the case? Yeah, Texas, great state, and you're originally Australian. But can you give us your a little bit of your background story, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally from Melbourne, Australia, and I now live in Austin, Texas. So my story is, and I guess I should say just I don't necessarily follow carnivore diet, just to be clear with everyone. But I'm super excited to be able to share, given that y'all are such great meat eaters, like best way to cook it, and I do know a lot about the science of it and what have you. And my situation was I was someone who really didn't, I loved eating meat. I didn't cook a whole lot of it because I was very intimidated by it. And it was my first trip to Texas many, many, many years ago, where you come to Texas and you have to eat barbecue. That's just what you do, right? It's one of the things you have to do when you come here. And I had that first taste of barbecue, and it was a revolution because we didn't have anything like that in Australia. We didn't really have smoked meats. And I kept coming back to Texas, kept eating more barbecue. And then I was trying to figure out, got curious about how it was made and why did a brisket in Australia look nothing like a brisket in the United States? And I ended up kind of falling down this rabbit's hole of cattle breeds and feed and understanding why the brisket was smaller, like cattle production, and just inadvertently learned so much about meat and beef in particular that it also unlocked a whole lot of cooking stuff at the same time. So I started learning which cuts to buy. I started challenging myself. I didn't own a grill, went out and bought a charcoal grill, like wasn't really interested in messing with propane. I thought I'm going to start with the hardest one, and if I can nail that, we can work backwards. So for me, it's been a double journey of an exploration of live fire cooking and barbecue and grilling, but also learning a lot about meat and cuts. And I'm very much for celebrating, using the whole animal as well. So there are some amazing secondary cuts that I definitely think don't get enough of a look in, and that's what I like to concentrate on as well. Not just the ones that we all know and love, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of things that people aren't aware of, and you just kind of get your feet wet, and you kind of used to. A lot of people. There's a lot of people that before this they've never had a ribeye steak, or they've never tried so many things, and there's so many things out there. It's really surprising to me that Australia, which is a huge cattle country as well. I mean, they've got a huge cattle industry, doesn't celebrate and really celebrate the brisket like Texas does. I mean, you're in Austin, Texas. I mean, Franklin's Barbecue, Terry Black, some of the other big name brisket places, and they're Salt Lake, and there's a lot. I used to live in Austin. I went to college there, and so I'm familiar with that area, and I love going back there. There's some wonderful stuff. But why don't you, if you don't mind, I mean, that's a great way to segue, because I wanted to ask you how's the best way to make a brisket, but talk a little bit about the science and why it's different, and obviously breed and feed and all those things go into that. But talk a little bit about what you've discovered, if you don't mind.
So we in Australia, the butcher tradition follows British butchery, not American butchery. So first of all, there's obviously multiple ways that you can butcher an animal. For example, a flat iron steak, if you cut top blade steaks, you can't cut flat iron steaks because you have to make the choice to do it one or the other. So traditionally, the Australian consumer was looking for extremely lean beef. So butchers would automatically cut most of the fat away. You would have everything what we call denuded, so the fat and the skin and silver skin, what have you, would be taken off of it. So a brisket in Australia was a rolled flat, which is, you know, what you would buy for like Jewish pot roast. There was no such thing really as a packer brisket, which is what we look for Texas barbecue, which has that nice decal on it and the two different points and all of the fat, so that the cook or the pitmaster can trim it as they want it. In addition, you've got a lot of the cattle in Australia are grass-fed. Traditionally, there are some unbelievable quality grass-fed meats coming out of Australia that marble more than prime. But traditionally, a grass-fed animal won't get as much intramuscular marbling, which is those little veins of fat through the meat, as a grain-fed animal, just because it fattens quicker on grain. So the physical size of the animals are smaller because of the genetics. And then on top of that, back in the day, they used to harvest at, you know, anywhere between 12 and 18 months. So the animals were physically smaller than America as well. You know, everything's bigger in Texas. The United States likes to do everything bigger and bolder, and the same goes for the cattle. Just generations and generations of taking care of genetics. And, you know, we know most of the great Angus genetics in America can be traced to Montana. They have wonderful Angus genetics that we're starting to see here in Texas as well. So the meat would be physically smaller. And when it comes to smoking, there's a critical mass of size. A brisket needs to be a minimum size to kind of work, otherwise it turns into leather. So that was the big thing that we started to see in the beginning. Now animals are being slaughtered later. Even the grass-fed ones that I mentioned will sometimes get 24 months on them. They're doing long days in grain as well. So you're starting to see back there bigger briskets and them being trimmed differently too. But, you know, it was a little bit of an uphill battle for Australians who were interested in doing barbecue in the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just not to be stereotypical, but we always hear, you know, throw another shrimp on the Barbie, you know, from Australia. And I mean, we assume it's a big barbecue nation. I assume they still are, but I mean, it's kind of, I don't know. Growing up in Texas, you know, I spent most of my high school, college, and early years in Texas. I just kind of thought that was, doesn't everybody do this? But it is, I guess, kind of unique. And even in the United States, people will argue about who has the best barbecue. But
Right.
I'm partial to Texas. I'm living here in California, and that was kind of, you know, it's kind of, whereas Texas, you can't throw a rock and not find some brisket, but here in California, you got to drive 10, 15 miles to get a decent brisket. What is so other than the size, what animals make the best briskets, and what other things do you look for when you're working with that particular cut? And we can talk about some of the other stuff.
So one of the things with brisket, and you find the similar things with beef cheeks and beef shank, is that it's a muscle that has an incredible amount of natural collagen in it. And when you cook collagen, it converts to gelatin, which gives you that lovely, unctuous, gelatinous mouthfeel that we sort of love about the richness of brisket. They are all cuts that require long, low and slow cooking to tenderize them. But that's the main thing I think that makes brisket so special for people. And actually even beef ribs are another one that have that similar kind of mouthfeel. If you wanted to talk about the difference, looking at something like an eye of round, which is an extremely lean muscle from the hindquarter, you're never going to have that kind of rich sumptuousness because that muscle just doesn't have the same amount of collagen. And generally you find that not only is it just a way that muscle is built, but of course there's a correlation between to how hard that muscle works. So the brisket being in the chest of the animal, and it's standing on 2 feet all day and moving, just like the cheeks masticating all the time, is going to be a very hard-working cut.
What I'm just wondering, because you said you came here and you just had no clue, and how long did it take, and what kind of mistakes did you make along the way trying to figure out, to get to where you're at now with this? Because this is, obviously there's athletes that spend years perfecting their craft. There's, musicians. There's, I came from a physician background. It took years to get where you really get good at that sort of stuff. So what was a journey like, and what kind of sort of problems did you encounter?
Um, I've been extremely proactive in, I guess, self-education. If I could have my time and go back, I now know that there's actual meat science degrees that you can do, which I wasn't even aware existed at the time I went to college many, many moons ago. But um, I people in the meat industry are tremendously interested in telling you about what they do. I assumed that it would be very closed off. Like, I was just at a feedlot in Australia last year, and I thought, it would be no photos, don't talk about it. And they told me they had school groups tour through because they're trying to dispel a lot of these myths that are associated. I spoke to ranchers. I visited slaughterhouses. When I moved to Texas, I experienced hunting. Like, I would drive past baby fawns and be like, oh my God, adorable. But I knew that if I was going to be a meat advocate, I kind of also had a responsibility to, at least for my, just for my comfort level, to make sure that I could not only watch an animal being dispatched, but do it. So, and now I'm a super keen venison hunter, love butchering it myself. That's part of it for me. But it was a lot of trial and error, and it was a lot of learning and a lot of short courses at Texas A&M. And I've just moved. I've got giant like meat science manuals and things like that. And it's twofold: one, learning about the meat, and then two, obviously learning how to cook it. And I have cremated my fair share of meat in my time. I usually the biggest mistake I think would probably be raw chicken wings, which, sometimes no matter how many years you get under your belt, if you're juggling, it's like having all the bowls in the air. If you're juggling a grill full of chicken wings and you have this very small thermometer that you're trying to tempt for safety, every now and again, one can slip through the cracks. So that's what I would definitely classify as a bit of a disaster. But I think that your community would probably agree with me when I say that there's a base deliciousness to meat that even if you mess it up, it's still pretty good. Like, you can get it great, but there's not going to be any like obscene disasters other than maybe a grossly undercooked tough cut. And in that case, you just throw it back in and keep cooking. So it was just a long journey. I mean, I've been doing this for over 10 years now. And just trial and error. And everyone says, well, so many people are into barbecue now, and it's like, well, I think people are spending too much time kind of watching YouTube because it's available to them, and just before they get out there, just trying to watch too much. The best thing that you can do, the best way you get great about cooking steak, is to cook it again and again and again. And that way also you get to learn how you like it cooked, which is really important too. And then about 4 years ago, I came out, I've seen a couple of people comment about the hat, and I guess I should have opened with this, but the whole point is that there's actually a whole seasoning line called Hardcore Carnivore, which is often why, Sean, we get tagged so frequently together. Because a lot of the carnivore community uses the product because it is suitable for the diet. So I brought that into the line, and then it just kept exploding from there.
When a lot of people think about barbecuing meat and hunting and butchery, we usually associate that with a, kind of a man, or a kind of even a fat guy or something like that. I mean, but you're clearly not that. Did you have any sort of, I mean, when you were trying to get into the community, trying to learn, did you have anybody say, hey, you're just a woman and you can't do this? Was that ever a problem for you, or are you pretty well accepted into that sort of fraternity, I suppose?
It's actually been remarkably accepting. No one stopped me from doing what I was doing. No one deterred me. No one said I couldn't. I think it was also a reason I made a tremendous effort to be able to speak to more than just how to cook it, but the why, the butchery, the how, the myoglobin, the everything. Because if someone, you need to be, in some ways, and it's sad, but you need to be above reproach or beyond reproach. So if someone comes to you and challenges you with something, you have the answers, and then you can prove why you really deserve to be in a position where you're telling people that kind of stuff. So The only thing I'd say that I see that's a little bit negative is I unfortunately do get a lot of mansplaining on social media, but that's not people telling me that I can't do it. That's just, folks who, assume that because I'm they might see one of my videos and they'll tell me their opinion on how to do it and how I should do it better. But that's already, I've got a few years under my belt already, so that's a little bit different from being deterred. But other than that, it's been actually really, really accepting. So it's very, very cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think with social media, you can't help that. I mean, I'm a world record holder on rowing, and I get people telling me they think I should row, and I'm like, look, I've got the world record on this stuff. I kind of have a little insight, but let me just ask you about some of the I think the science is fascinating, and I think what are some of the things that most people don't know? I mean, there's some things out there that most people don't know about meat and how either how it's raised or how the science behind it works and things that might kind of educate us a little bit.
Sure. The most common misnomers I see, and I'm sure your audience knows about the labeling of all natural. So all natural doesn't mean anything. Obviously, you need to look specifically for grass finished, not just grass fed, because all cattle in the US starts off grass fed. Somehow people think that there are these big like factory pigeonhole facilities where the cattle are birthed in these little concrete boxes. I mean, all cattle start off on a cow-calf operation. So they're all born under normal circumstances. They're on milk, they're on a little bit of grass, and then some of them will be then moved to grain. So one is how they're raised, how they're born, and what that actual industry looks like. Another part of it is, like I said, the labeling. I also think that there's a huge, I like talking about people thinking that the color or the blood of meat. So particularly when you buy vacuum sealed meats, you'll see a collection of liquid in the bag that most people will assume is blood. And it's actually not blood. It's called purge, which is literally just water coming out of the muscle naturally, and myoglobin, which is the protein similar to our hemoglobin that gives blood its color. And myoglobin is actually super cool. It has 3 states it can exist in: metmyoglobin, metmyoglobin, oxymyoglobin. And basically when you buy a steak, maybe on a foam tray, and it looks beautifully cherry red on the outside, and you get it home and flip it over and it's brown on the other side, that's the reaction of, that's the metmyoglobin. So that's the lack of oxygen interacting with that myoglobin. It's perfectly safe to eat. It's just not really appealing to us in color. It's the same as if you take something out of vacuum seal and it can appear really anemic and just that real kind of pale color. But if you open it from the vacuum seal and let it interact with the oxygen, you will see the meat start to bloom. So you'll see that color come back into it. And I think that, especially as people who are looking to make meat a primary part of their diet, I eat meat 7 days a week. My problem is that I love carbs too much. I really wish I didn't, but that's my problem. But I think when you're introducing so much meat to your diet, it's expensive and it can be really intimidating, and you need to know what you're looking at. You don't want to think, oh, well, I have to throw this out because it's brown. So it's, I think, super handy for people to understand, not fear getting sick when you understand basic principles as well, even about internal temperatures too.
What are your thoughts on dry aging? Do you do that? Is it something that you're a proponent of?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I've got a dry aging setup in my garage, which is a little bit extra, but I'm okay with that. It's a dedicated fridge, and I actually have on my website, there's a 3,000 word article about how to do your own dry aging at home. I love the flavor introduction that dry aging brings. So there's 2 things happening during dry aging. One is the reduction of water in the muscle. So you're basically concentrating the muscle and concentrating the flavor. But 2 is, in certain instances, like in my fridge, where controlling the good molds that grow, which is kind of like the same as introducing mold to cheese. You get a very funky, nutty, kind of blue cheesy note to the meat that can be really, really interesting. It's quite polarizing and not everybody likes it. It is a very indulgent and expensive task because you do lose so much as the meat dries, and to get it more extreme in age and more extreme in flavor, you can end up with, you know, a ribeye or a strip that's quite tiny at the end of it. But, you know, if you're a meat nerd, it's certainly fun to be able to experiment. And I know there are a lot of bags out there. I've messed around with the bags as well, and it's definitely a good option for people who, you know, just want to kind of dip their toes in, but it's definitely not the same as true dry aging, I would say. It's just a very different eating experience.
What are some of the, you know, like the mistakes that people make? You know, I mean, is, you know, what cooking from frozen, cooking from fridge? I mean, does it needs to be at room temperature? When do you season? Do you season before, after, during? I mean, does it depend on the cut of meat? Can you talk a little bit about that sort of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Freezing does change the cellular structure and the way that the water freezes inside meat. So the best way is thaw as long as possible. Basically put it into the fridge to thaw for a very, very long time. Obviously, you know, defrosting in your microwave, speed defrosting in water in your sink is gonna result in a steak that's much more watery because it doesn't hold the water as well. So be prepared when you thaw things. Thaw it in plenty of time in a slow and safe environment. Definitely, that whole take it out and let it come to room temperature thing is an interesting one because it's like a half truth. The steak will never actually come to room temperature, and it wouldn't be safe to eat if it did that. It would take, you know, eight plus hours for that core to get to room temp. But what you're doing when you take that steak out of the fridge in advance is just taking the chill off and allowing surface condensation to happen. The thing that I love about red meat is that crust that you get when you can cook it, and that's called the Maillard reaction. And the Maillard reaction is a chemical reaction between reducing sugars and amino acids. And in order for that reaction to happen, moisture needs to be gone. So it's the same as overcrowding your pan when you're cooking ground meat and you just end up with this kind of foaming gray mess instead of a really nice aggressive brown. And the same goes for steaks or anything that you're looking to sear. If you take it out of the fridge in advance and let that surface chill come off, let that condensation come to the surface, and then use a paper towel to aggressively wipe up the surface, you're going to see that you're going to get that sear so much more efficiently and faster because you're allowing everything to be in place for that Maillard reaction to happen. The two other biggest tips I would say, when you do season, you want to season in a certain window. So you either want to season immediately before you cook, or season and then leave it for at least 35 to 45 minutes. Because in between that time, all that's doing is allowing the salt, which is obviously going to be withdrawing the moisture. It allows it to pull it out, but it doesn't allow it enough time to soak back in. So if you season and cook immediately, you don't give that salt enough time to take the moisture out of your meat. And if you season and then leave it a little, you allow enough time to withdraw, and then it actually sucks effectively a brine solution back into the meat. There's also an article on my website about dry brining, which is how you can do that in the fridge for 2 to 3 days with the steak in advance of cooking it. And then the other thing is buy a good meat thermometer. It'll never let you down. It is how you cook a steak perfectly every time. It is how you cook chicken and poultry and ground meats to safe temperatures every time. It is the most useful tool in the kitchen.
How do you feel about high heat cooking? You know, I've got a grill that goes to 1500 degrees, which I often use. You know, it's a top down, you know, kind of almost like a salamander type thing, and I get a nice crust on there. But are you concerned? And you talk about the Maillard reaction. There's people that are concerned about, you know, the development of things called heterocyclic amines or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from, you know, charring the meat. My argument has always been, you know, humans have been cooking for as long as we've been humans over open fire. But do you have any concerns about those things?
I don't, and it's for similar reasons. So basically, when bacon became a class 1 carcinogen, according to the FDA, and everyone started freaking out because every few years they like to, talk bad about deli meats and, make meat the focus of their campaigns. And when that happened and people were asking very actively about it, I said, well, do you know what else is a number 1 class carcinogen? Alcohol. And how many people are happy to be in a bar every night? I think life is a calculated risk. And you, especially now during these times, you have to enjoy living your life to some degree because, arguably so many things can kill you. So many things. I mean, how many things have we discovered can potentially be carcinogenic that we do in everyday life? And there are plenty of people that never get sick, and there are ones that do. So for me personally, I would rather have that flavor, enjoy it, take that small risk along with a drink every now and again. That to me is worth it. So.
Yeah, if you look at the data on those particular compounds, there's not really a dose-related effect, and so there's some very good data that refutes that. And most of the studies have been really super high dosed in lab animals, particularly rodents. And so I'm not particularly impressed. We've seen I don't know if you're aware of the studies that came out late last year looking at no real strong evidence suggested meat is a carcinogen or driver of heart disease or anything like that. So that sort of shows that the evidence is pretty weak out there. Do you get any, I get a lot of, and many of us here in this community that are vocal about eating meat get a lot of pushback from plant-based advocates. Do you ever get any people out there calling you a murderer and that type of stuff?
Yes. And I had it doesn't happen that often anymore. I had it really badly. I got attacked, like fully attacked on Instagram a couple of years ago where like a major vegan account like sicked their people onto me. And I had to sit there for about 5 hours in order to control the comments. And they were saying things like, I hope you get raped by an animal and I hope you end up dead on a floor bleeding out somewhere. That's what you deserve. Like very, very graphic wishes of death and destruction, which I don't think endear people to them very much. But I don't get it that much. I got one the other day, same thing, and it's an immediate block and delete for me. That's the same reason that I went hunting. That's the same reason I challenged myself to do it, so that I know I can say, look, if push came to shove and I actually had to go out and do this and feed myself and not have the convenience of just ordering it in a lovely, clean little package, could I actually do it? I know that the answer for me is yes. And they're entitled to live their life however they want, but not tell me how to live mine. So.
Yeah, 100% agree. Let me ask you, because you mentioned hunting and you mentioned talking about venison and one of the issues, and I get a lot of hunters that ask me, how they can do a meat-based diet with game meat, and one of the problems, when you're not consuming carbohydrates, getting enough fat in. So, do you make any concessions when you're cooking, venison, which can be very lean? Do you somehow supplement the fat anyway, or how do you deal with those leaner types of game meats?
I mean, for my diet personally, I probably also have, and this is important to know, a really skewed version of the carnivore diet because a lot of great companies work with me. I work a lot with certified Angus beef and Wagyu companies, and that's, incredibly marbled stuff. So I do look on certain days to supplement with leaner meats because that with what I'm eating is a balanced diet. Certainly when you are, I don't think if you need enough fat, I don't think you would be able to do it with venison, because even when you make venison breakfast sausage, you usually add pork fat in because there's usually that 80-20 minimum lean meat to fat ratio when you're making sausage. So every now and again, I've got a nice fattier whitetail, which is very rare for wild deer here in Texas. Because they're usually, very lean animals. And especially if they're younger, they're definitely not going to have that development. So short of a introducing tallow or lard from another animal to supplement, they wouldn't necessarily have to buy the protein, but you can certainly buy the fat. I'm a huge fan of also rendering tallow myself. There's a lot of different stuff you can use it for, and actually, because the makeup of tallow is so similar to human sebum, it makes an amazing body butter, which is also a recipe on the website. So that would be my only advice. I definitely don't think that you would be able to get, just based on what you've said, that enough fat to do the whole diet. You would have to supplement, but there are certainly ways that you could do that.
Do you use any other fats like goose or duck fat or some of those other flavors in your cooking? And do you do much in the way of poultry? Or is it all pretty much red meat or pork? I mean, I imagine pork tends to make it on the barbecue quite a bit, but how much do you spend time with those types of things? And is there a difference in the way you deal with those types of things? And different seasonings, I mean, when you're making your seasoning blends, I mean, or how do you determine what's going to make a good taste? And does it have an effect on the consistency or the mouthfeel of the meat with the different seasonings? And how does that work?
I definitely use duck fat. I try and use animal fats in a lot, like in place of olive oil. So when you go to brown something, even when I make biscuits, I can put, pork lard in there. So um, I just like eating red meat the most, so that tends to be the most in my diet. But I certainly do cook the gamut, because that's what people expect of me, and that's part of, just exploring your way through carnivore cooking. Obviously, when you're talking about leaner meats, pork loin, or white meats, chicken, poultry, you want to introduce a brine generally, which is a way to force extra moisture into the meat to make up for the moisture that you lose during cooking. So it's not necessarily that you're making it more moist, you're just making it as moist as it were if it didn't lose anything during the cook. When it comes to the seasonings, we have 5 in the line right now. The first one actually has activated charcoal in it. So it's for red meats because it looks jet black on the outside. Then you get that beautiful medium rare. And then, my game and lamb seasoning is very, very fragrant. It's got a lot of allspice and cinnamon because gamier meats can take a little bit more interesting flavors, I think. But other than that, you want to basically learn the difference. I think there's lighter proteins and heavier proteins. And so lighter would be lean pork and poultry. Heavier would be, pork shoulder and I would say all red meats. And the heavier the protein, the more powerful the flavor I think you can pair with it. The more bold pepper, the more bold seasonings, because it's got that richness to stand up to it, really. And that's why in Texas style barbecue, and of course you would know this, like there's that incredibly coarse black pepper and salt Dalmatian rub that they use down here, Dalmatian because it's black and white, that is, when you see it for the first time and you see these pitmasters apply it in the levels that they're applying it, you think that can't be right. It looks 4 to 5 times more than you would think you would use, but that's how you get that beautiful bark and crust. And because the meat is so rich, and because it's got all that collagen, and because it's got all that, I saw someone say sticky meat earlier, it really can handle it. It's a really beautiful pairing. So
What is your personal favorite? Do you have a personal favorite, or is there too many to count, or maybe a couple personal favorites?
of the seasonings,
Well, just meat in general, like a cut of meat, maybe combined with a seasoning, either one.
I definitely, I grew up eating a lot of lamb in Australia. I love lamb. I wish Americans were more crazy about it so that we could farm more of it. The price would come down. But the lamb is spectacular. I'm actually I go through stages. I'm having a love affair right now with sirloin steaks because they're really beefy in flavor to me. I love that texture and that coarseness of the grain. And that's one that I pair with that black seasoning for sure. But my death row steak would be a ribeye with the biggest cap on it that I could find. Being that, that spinalis dorsi, or that ribeye cap muscle, is kind of considered by beef aficionados to be the king of steaks, the best on the animal. What would yours be?
Yeah, I would echo. Ribeye is something that if I had only one thing I could eat for the rest of my life, it would be ribeye. I've kind of done that, quite honestly. For I've gone 6 months eating nothing but ribeyes every day. You know, sometimes three or four of them. But um, what was I going to ask you here? Oh, somebody was asking me about. Well, I mean, the lamb. What is I've had some delicious lamb. I used to live in New Zealand. I've been Iceland had some really nice lamb. I've had some good lamb in France. What is the best way to cook lamb? Or no, actually, here's what I want to ask you. You said sirloin. So sirloin for a lot of people can be very challenging because it's a relatively lean cut. How do you find that sirloin does the best? What's the best way to cook a sirloin?
So whenever I'm grilling, no matter what it is, I always set up my grill for what I call a two-zone cook. I cook over charcoal. I like the flavor that I get from it. And the two-zone cook is basically taking your grill and dumping the coals just in one side. I do this no matter what I'm cooking because it basically gives you a hot and a cool zone and that little in-between zone to work with. So you can do the reverse sear that's incredibly popular right now, which is the idea of starting that steak on the indirect heat. The idea of a reverse sear, I should say quickly, is just the idea of cooking something slow to start and then searing to finish. So the slow could be a low oven, a sous vide, an indirect grill, and then that hot sear can be cast iron, direct grill, whatever. But for grilling, you could start it on the indirect side until it gets to round about the temperature you're looking for, and then finish, stoke your coals and give it a really aggressive sear and be done. Or you can do it the other way, which is the traditional way. The nice part about reverse sear, if you're starting off trying to get that perfect, like Instagram worthy steak, is that it's very, very forgiving in terms of giving you that perfect result without much graying on the edges. But I tend these days just to do a really aggressive sear to start, and then I'll just push it to that indirect side to let it keep going up in temperature until it's where I want it to be, which for me is 135 medium for sirloin is great. The biggest trick as well is I'm definitely a multi-flipper. So some people are set it and leave it. If your coals are hot enough, which they should be, charcoal is cheaper than meat. Don't be afraid to use like 25% more coal than you think you're using. You can flip it every 30 seconds. And even though that first flip will look really underwhelming, if you keep going, you're drying that surface, the Maillard will happen. You'll get that gorgeous crust eventually. And because you've kept it moving, that's why that steak, as long as it's, a relative thickness, probably 1.5 inches at least, that's why that steak will be perfectly cooked on the inside, because you haven't let the heat source be on one side for too long. So I'm definitely on team, I call it JKF, just keep flipping.
Yeah, I've seen some people debate on that topic. It's kind of interesting to see that. And so I assume you get your sear and then you throw a meat thermometer in it and let it chill on the cooler side until it reaches that temperature. Is that how that works for you?
Yeah, I don't leave a thermometer in it now because I've done it long enough where I can kind of do the guessy test. But yeah, effectively that's it. And then you give it a little bit of a rest. That's the other nice thing about that reverse sear. If you rest it in between that low stage and then you actually bring it off the grill for maybe 5 to 7 minutes and then get your real aggressive sear, you can eat it straight away because you're only going to be searing it for a minute each side. It's had its rest. You're maximizing the juiciness. And so that's another reason a lot of people like it.
Yeah, earlier question I forgot to ask is somebody was when you said when you take your steak out of the fridge to let the chill come off, how long does that usually take? And then I assume you're patting it dry to absorb any of the moisture that kind of came to the surface. How long is that? I know you said it's not 8 hours to bring it to room temperature, but you may set it out for a little while. How long do you typically do that for?
Yeah, I would say 30 to 45 minutes is plenty. That's enough. Again, you're just looking for that surface chill. You're looking enough for it to just. It's basically to equalize into the kitchen temperature just on the surface. So that should bring enough to pat it and go to town, go to sear town.
Yeah. So you would say you would take it out of the fridge. If you wanted to season it up, salt it on both sides, let it sit for 30, 40, 45 minutes and then throw it on the grill. Is that, or season them direct right before it goes on the heat. One of those two options, huh?
Yeah, exactly. I just usually take it out and let it alone, so I'm not messing with it until I'm ready. And then when it's time to cook and the coals are ready, or your pan is hot enough if you're cooking indoors, um, that's when you pat it dry, season it, get it in that pan, get it on that grill.
So this is something that almost never happens to me, but some people have asked me about this before. Reheating a steak. If I got a steak, it's all going down. It's not, there's going to be any leftovers. But I mean, for those people that don't eat very much and they have a half a steak left over, how do we reheat our steaks? Do we throw it in the microwave, or is that just sacrilege? I mean, how do we get that
I
back
guess
to?
it depends how hungry you are, but um, really, sous vide is one of the best methods for reheating, particularly larger pieces of meat. If you're going to do brisket, if you're going to do barbecue, it's just that gentle heat. I would say a very low setting in the oven. This is only if you want to preserve. If you got it perfectly medium rare and you want to eat it again at as close to when it originally came off the grill or originally came out of the pan, it's a very slow reheat. So microwaves are obviously a very fast reheat, which is why they can tend to overcook things. So, and the problem with doing it, for example, even trying to reheat it in the pan with the flip method I mentioned, is that now you're talking about a steak that is super cold at its core rather than one that's been, because you're just reheating, you're not cooking the whole way. So pan searing, don't recommend. Microwave, I don't recommend. I'd usually pop it in an oven. And if you want to be super anal about not cooking it too much on one side, even put it on a rack to allow airflow on both sides, and that way it'll cook a little more evenly. If you put it straight on a sheet pan or on foil on a sheet pan, obviously the metal is going to conduct heat into that one side.
So in Austin, do you have do you cook for people? I mean, are you doing like a commercial cooking operation or like a restaurant type of thing, or is it all sort of just, online type stuff? How does that work for you?
It is all online. The seasoning, the hardcore carnivore is, we also do things like merch and butcher's paper and other tools that carnivores and meat cooks need and like. And that's its whole thing, where we have worldwide distribution and we're lucky enough to be, in a lot of different places. So that's busy enough on its own. But my stuff, especially pre-COVID, it was traveling to teach a lot of grilling classes and attend a lot of events. Post-COVID, it's obviously at home a lot, but that's why I put out a new video every week. I put out a new recipe on the website every week. And I do, we do some private classes. Zoom classes is kind of what things have turned into now, but it's really just, putting the content out there for people to be able to use and enjoy. And that's what happens. We used to cook at, events here and there, but we don't have events anymore. So.
Well, hopefully that'll turn around. I mean, I suspect it will, and then, once we kind of just sort of figure out what's going on. Somebody was asking if you would be kind enough to let us have one of your recipes to host on our website. Is that a possibility for us, and link it back to you?
Yeah, for sure. We can find
Awesome.
something for y'all. Maybe we could do a custom, a custom how to do this cut or that cut.
So in Austin, Texas, is there a place you go to for when you don't want to cook for yourself? Is there any place you go to get some food?
I actually rarely cook. Like, I'd rarely cook brisket now because we are stone's throw from any number of the best briskets in the world. So I definitely find myself eating barbecue out a lot. I still do cook a lot at home because I'm doing recipe testing. I do cook a lot of barbecue, but brisket is a serious commitment. It's a 16-hour commitment, and then you're left with a lot of meat. I do have a question for y'all. Maybe you can let me know in chat. I don't ever get sick of eating meat. I do eat it 7 days a week, but that's why I like to mix up the lean and the richer ones, because I don't think I could eat brisket for 5 days in a row. It would have to be sort of a brisket and then a steak. I don't know. Does that happen in the carnivore community, or because you're trying to get that perfect balance, do you just kind of end up with richer cuts or eating whatever you've cooked like that? So I'd love to I'd love to get that if y'all are willing to answer that. But other than that, my one horrible secret is Chinese food. That's I can't make that well. I'll let them do that for me. It's phenomenal. That's my dirty, like, I'm having a bad night. I'm having a day off from what I should be eating. Let's go order Chinese.
And, it's interesting, particularly I find, I think, you'll see a lot of people, some people do, most people skew more towards fat, again, because they're not ingesting carbohydrates. So they tend to, prioritize, getting enough fat in it. And that amount varies from person to person. And there are some people that rotate it out. And I think from a sustainability standpoint, a little bit of variety makes life a little nicer. Speaking of Chinese, I've been playing with pork belly a little bit, and I don't know if you've played with that very much. It can be a very delicious thing, but it can be a challenge a little bit. And the Chinese seem to have sort of perfected it. As you probably are aware, pork is the number one eaten meat in the world by volume. Beef is second, even though there's a lot of beef that's eaten throughout the world. And Asia's picking up that pace as China gets more wealth. We're seeing more and more beef production and exports going to those guys. And a lot of it comes from Australia, as you're probably aware. But what are your thoughts on pork and pork belly and with Chinese and different, the different cultures and how they prepare the meat? Have you been exposed to that? And obviously Texas is one way, and I'm partial to it and a little bit biased and love the Texas approach. But what have you been impressed with other parts of the world and the way they prepare meats?
I mean, growing up in Australia, so being in Texas, you have access and proximity to Mexico and some of those traditional methods, which is incredible. But Australia has proximity to Southeast Asia. So we have a lot of Vietnamese and Chinese and Thai foods, which, has been really, really great to be able to sort of have exposure to all those different types. Pork belly is amazing. The biggest thing that surprises me about pork in America is how frequently you find its skin off, because pork skin is phenomenal. And I have to go usually to Asian markets if I'm going to buy pork belly skin on to get that proper, that would be a classic Australian roast, like that pork roast with crackle, or, porchetta with, they call it crackling. Is a real treat. I feel like people are really missing out, not getting it here. I think that there's a tremendous amount to learn from those cultures that are much more associated with using the whole animal. A lot of it comes from necessity, that you can't afford to waste it. Barbacoa traditionally is the whole beef head cooked in an underground oven, and they would pick it, all of the meat out of the head, because why on earth would you waste it? And even now, when you go to a taqueria in Mexico, you can choose, do you want cheek meat, sesos, brains, do you want tongue, do you want, now it's a delicacy for them. Each of it has a different delicate flavor, but it obviously started by not even honoring the animal. It'd be nice to think that that was the case, but it's just a matter of, we've got it, we need to eat as much as we can, and that's what needs to happen. The Chinese are obviously incredibly adept at using nearly everything, and that's one thing that's helped the Australian beef industry tremendously. When you go through a slaughterhouse in Australia, it's really interesting because they have the offal room, and they'll be there separating. There's one tiny little piece of muscle that runs down the esophagus, and that goes, if they manage to sell that into China, they'll box just that up and go. Indonesians will buy the lip meat, not the cheek meat, the lip meat. Chinese buy esophagus, they buy pizzle, they buy tendon. So it's amazing that the industries need to have all of these people eating these other parts of the animal to keep our ribeyes relatively affordable, because that's how you spread the cost along the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's not just the meat. I mean, if we look at how, cattle are processed, I mean, their hides, their hooves, I mean, it goes into so many products, I mean, household goods and cell phones and, everything, it's, they literally, there's next to zero waste from an animal if it's processed correctly. That's my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about, back in Australia, obviously you've got an Aboriginal population. Do they have any traditions with their, are you aware of that, or did you ever get into that? And how they, because I mean, obviously there's kangaroo and they obviously a lot of the big birds that used to run around Australia got taken out by Aboriginals. And do you find that they still have a pretty good tradition with meat? Or I know much of their diet has been changed into westernized kind of, grains and sugar and to their health detriment. But do they still have a decent meat preparation heritage?
They do. It was more foraging. So from what I understand, this is sort of high school education coming back. But they used to eat a lot of goanna, which is kind of like an iguana. It's a giant lizard. The thing is, they were always a very, for lack of a better term, rustic culture. So it wasn't ever about how it tasted. It was just about sustaining yourself with enough calories. So you'd sort of throw a goanna on the fire until it's kind of cooked and just kind of throw it on there whole, and the skin would kind of be burnt off, and then you'd sort of eat pieces with charcoal still on there. They never really developed an advanced cuisine, I guess you would say, but the diet definitely consists of goanna, rue, witchetty grubs are another big one. So they're really fat. I believe they taste kind of like butter. They're big buttery grubs that they used to eat. And then they had some what they call bush seasonings. So we have a native lemon myrtle, which can taste like lemon pepper, and we have a bush tomato and things like that. But there's more things that can kill you that taste good in Australia. So I don't know how varied it was.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you guys are the home of, like, I don't know, the top seven of the top 10 venomous snakes in the world or something like that. It's just like a kind of dangerous out there. Yeah, I went hunting in New Zealand with a Maori, and he was scratching around looking for some hoo-hoo grubs he wanted us to eat. Now, he said it tasted kind of like peanut butter. And we never, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, we didn't find it. I wasn't keen on looking forward to eating the grubs, but yeah, I guess I would have tried them, but I
Yeah.
wasn't I wasn't that sad not to do that. Uh,
Excited to find out that New Zealand doesn't have any snakes on the whole country and it only has one kind of spider.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, wow.
they've got these giant cave wetters, which are some of the biggest bugs on insects on the planet apparently. But yeah, New Zealand's a pretty neat place too. So let me ask you, I guess one final thing there. What is the are you concerned that barbecue and meat is going to be replaced with, synthetic meat, or do you have concerns about that? Plant-based meat, is that in your mind a reality, or are we always going to be eating meat for the foreseeable future?
No, I don't think it's not a concern for me. I just read an article. There's an article in this month's Bon Appetit about a sustainable farmer who goes and does a tour of, I think it's Impossible Meats or something. And at the end, they kind of revealed to her that their basic master plan is to actually end the meat industry, not just subsidize it or help balance it, but to end it. And the problem is that there's a lot of people out there who choose certain foods for themselves based on nothing more than their feeling because they think it's better. So it's the same people who buy the all natural without knowing what all natural actually means. It's the same people who shop at Whole Foods. One of the biggest misnomers, I think, is that, oh, steak tastes better or meat tastes better when it's bought from your local rancher. Like, well, you don't know what the genetics on that cattle, you don't know if it's going to be an old cow, if it's going to be a dark cutter, what was the pH level at time of slaughter, how was it handled. Like, from a purely eating quality perspective, that's not necessarily true. But there are a lot of people who just want to feel warm and fuzzy and think their stuff's organic, or think, whatever it is, without knowing too much about it. And I think right now, fake meats are filling that for a lot of people. But when you scratch the surface to realize just how processed it is, which is usually what these people are trying to get away from in the first place, that's a real concern. Because at the end of the day, it's still putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the agricultural system to get the components to emulate the meat. And one of the things that I see a lot is them throwing around that 10% greenhouse emissions number, which is what the cattle industry or meat industry contributes to global greenhouse emissions every year. What they don't talk about is that in the US, that percentage is less than 3%. The fourth largest producer of beef in the world is India, which most people are shocked to find out because of the holy cow situation. And obviously, like many other industries in a second to third world country, there are lots of things to be improved on in terms of sustainability and how clean it is. So it's not even us that's the problem. So getting Americans to change their eating habits is not going to still affect that 7% plus of what's actually happening out there in the world. And then there's a lot of agricultural grazing that happens on land that isn't suitable to grow crops. And no one talks about that either. So you can't necessarily replace it. I think that there is a possibility that there may be an overall reduction in meat consumption if they change models, but it's not going anywhere. Not as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I look at, there might be a slight shift to where we see less in Western countries, but far more in like places like China, where it's the demand is just skyrocketing, and so I don't think there's going to be an overall worldwide reduction. Probably there'll be a continued. I know the beef industry projections are continued growth in that market, into the, for the foreseeable future. So interesting to see that Ethan Brown claiming Impossible Foods is going to end meat, within 15 years. I don't think that's plausible. But at the same time, I don't think we meat eaters should passively just ignore that, because there is a lot of wealth and money that's going into doing this stuff, and we see something like $5.7 trillion of industry capital aligned to create this $100 billion market, and to just dissuade, and persuade our children. We see that children being marketed to in schools and on TV shows and cartoons and internet, telling you that, don't eat meat because you're killing the planet and it's mean and awful and all that sort of stuff. So I do think as a community, all of us, whether we're pure carnivores or just, regular people that enjoy meat, have to come together. Jess, can you tell us where we can find you, find more information, how to get a hold of you, get some of your recipes, get some of your spices and other stuff that you have?
Absolutely. My website is jesspryles.com. There's recipes on there. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and then Hardcore Carnivore has its own social media and website too. So Hardcore Carnivore is where you get the seasoning and the merchandise, but you'll find one of us on the other. We're kind of all interconnected, but yeah, this has been really a pleasure. It's lovely getting to connect with other people who enjoy and appreciate meat as much as I do. And, even take it a step further. Like I'm actually quite in awe of what you guys are able to do. So good for y'all. And thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. And if you look around, we've got people that have cured suicidal depression and all kinds of diseases by going with meat. So it's really fun. And I look forward to getting back to Texas. Maybe I'll run into you and we can split a brisket or something like that at some point. Yeah,
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm sure the folks that see this on the replay will really enjoy it. And I fully support, and I really support people like you that can do this really well. I consider you guys pros when you're making the meat, and they certainly have my appreciation. You do, and the others that do that. So I thank you guys for doing what you do. Thank you.
Thank y'all. Appreciate it.
All right, we're going to shut down, guys. See you guys tomorrow. Take care.